Thank you very much for the introduction, and thanks very much for the organisers of this conference. I have just not had much to do with it. I kind of just turned up, and it's really been a very interesting first day. I hope some of my reflections at the moment will kind of build on what we talked about yesterday. I was on the radio a week ago, got the ODI phone call, can you go on the radio? There's talking about ending UK aid to India. And I went on saying that we should increase aid to India. And an old colleague of mine, some of you might know, Alex Wilkes, got in touch and said, I thought your whole book was about reducing aid. Actually, the book said African countries should gradually reduce their dependence on aid over time. But I also said that globally, aid needs to increase to respond to all the new challenges, but it needs to be transferred and used in a different way. But it wasn't till Simon Maxwell asked me to write a paper on aid to middle-income countries that I started really to flesh that out and kind of come up with some thoughts on that. That was part of the European Union programme that Simon and Michaela run. Is my presentation on? So, and that's when I began to realise that there are some common assertions that we have about aid to mix that I began to realise were not necessarily based on very good evidence and analysis, and also that thinking about aid to mix was giving me some clues about what the overall future of aid might be. So what I'm going to do is present some of those assertions, hopefully dispel them, and then give you kind of my idea about what the future of aid might look like based on that. First of all, the idea that MICs no longer need aid. That, in my view, is mix leading, and that, for those of you who are not, for whom English is not your first language, is a very amusing wordplay. First of all, and this has been discussed recently by Martin Revalian, the way that countries are separated by average income is, and I use this word advisedly, entirely random. We don't even know what the evidence and research was that led to those separations decades ago. And I think even more importantly than the fact that it's arbitrary is it's incredibly stingy. Who decided, it was someone in a wealthy country, I'm sure, that once a country moves from incredibly poor to only very, very poor, rich country obligations to those countries begin to end. It's a stingy way of thinking, and Martin Revalian, as I say, has recently written about this and said, it's time to get rid of these arcane income thresholds. And the second reason why middle-income countries still need aid, firstly because poverty is still a very great issue there, and by the way, we have on the panel someone from the newest middle-income country, which is South Sudan. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you guys have seen that. I think that gives an idea of the kind of arcaneness and arbitrariness of this system. And the second reason is that as we expand our objectives, moving from MDGs, poverty eradication, climate finance is already a global objective. Post-2015, we're likely to see an expansion towards other kinds of sustainable development, ecological ecosystem management, etc. And then thinking about even other objectives such as technological connectivity, technology poverty. Those are expensive things that are going to cost money. And that's why, and that's the second reason why middle-income countries still need aid. And I was taken with this quote from Adolf Kloker-Lesch, who said, "Development only really begins when extreme poverty is eradicated." So there's this instinct that once we eradicate extreme poverty, let's all just go home and look at our own countries. On the contrary, that's the first step to a much longer process of development. Second common assertion, that the kind of lick-mick-hick progress tends to be linear. Again, it's mixed leading. If you look at the numbers here from the licks in the 1980s, we actually saw a doubling of the amount of low-income countries in the 80s and 90s. Yes, in the last decade, that number's halved, which is great news. But the assumption that that's just going to continue, I'm one of those people that doesn't massively believe in economic projections. Sue me. I've just lived through the biggest economic crisis that anyone here has lived through. I tend to look at history and think that actually, the possibility of regression to low-income states is quite probable. We've heard about the mix trap from other people yesterday, and in fact, the biggest aid recipients of the last few years, massive aid recipients in one understanding of the term aid, would be Ireland, Spain, and Greece. We're moving to a horizontality of the role of global public spending. Common assertion number 3, most poor people live in middle-income countries. I'm rattling through because I haven't got long. That is famous Andy Sumner numbers. This is also misleading, even though it's actually true. It's misleading. On one hand, and we've heard from Andrew's presentation yesterday, it's probably, according to some statistics anyway, only temporal. So it shouldn't necessarily influence too much our way of thinking about aid. But the second reason why it's misleading is that it depends entirely, and Andy recognises this, on movements in 5 countries. If you take Pakistan, Indonesia, India, China and Nigeria out of those numbers, there is no movement whatsoever between, if you look at changes between 1990 in blue and 2008 in red, the same number of people living in poor people living in middle-income countries, same number of poor people living in low-income countries. So this realisation got me thinking that actually we're over-focusing on an income. Let's start looking at aid levels. So I started to do some work on what Annalisa at the back there and I are describing as low aid countries, medium aid countries and high aid countries. And this fourth assertion that you often hear is that aid has somehow done its job in middle-income countries. And I think this is a really interesting assertion. I think it's misleading because I think it misunderstands what the role of aid is in countries where aid is a very small percentage of GDP. It's a very, very different role that it plays than aid in highly aid-dependent countries, 30, 40% of GDP. When aid is under 1% of GDP, it's playing a very, very different role. It's not a huge cash transfer to boost the economy. It's playing a role to support and incentivize and catalyze specific areas of interest. And in my analysis, there's no reason why that shouldn't continue. So I came up with these interesting numbers. In 2009 over here, you can see that 75%, 3/4 of the world's population, live in countries that receive less than 2% of their GDP in aid, what I call low aid countries. Now that's quite similar to what Andy Sumner seems to be saying. Until you look at 1990, the number is almost exactly the same. In other words, for the last 20 years at least, and probably for longer, the vast majority of poor people in this world have lived in countries where aid is a very small, under 1% is green, very small percentage of the country's economy. It's a misunderstanding to believe that aid has played a huge role in bringing these people out of poverty. But it's also wrong to suggest that it's irrelevant. It's played a very significant role, but a very low level. So you know, for instance, what's the big difference between aid? People imply that countries are reducing their aid dependence. India's never been aid dependent. 0.45% cannot be described as aid dependent. What's the big difference now? And my argument is that the big difference now is more to do with the West having no money than to do with changes in the actual reality of middle-income countries. And that's classically expressed by the Spanish. I don't know if we have any from ACID here. The Spanish, until about 3 years ago, were massively expanding their aid to Latin America, which is fundamentally a middle-income continent. And of course now they're massively cutting it. That has nothing to do, I can assure you, with what's going on in Latin America. And then there's also an implication that aid to middle-income countries might be not so important, doesn't really mean anything. I started looking at this, and in my book I argued that aid dependency is a massive problem. It undermines accountability, too much conditionality. And actually, the more you become a middle-income country, the less you depend on aid. Actually, possibly the more effective aid can be. So if you're looking at value for money, doubling aid to Uganda, for instance, is very unlikely to double the effectiveness of aid. In fact, I would argue it would be an extremely damaging thing for the country. Doubling aid to India pretty much is going to double the impact of your money. Double the impact of your intervention, rather. So I think that's another element to look at. Common assertion number 5. Aid from mix differs fundamentally from DAC aid, and we always hear about the difference from South-South cooperation and North-South cooperation. Well, on the panel yesterday we have Brazil, China, I can't remember the other ones, South Africa and Mexico. Now, you know, the differences between those countries, in my view, are far more great than the differences between some South-South countries and some North countries. So it's a misleading statement. My argument is that actually if you start to look at regional areas, Latins are quite similar. Eastern donors are quite similar. Your Western donors are quite similar. Not forgetting the Arab donors and possibly the Nordic donors. That's actually a more sensible categorization of countries than this very binary and probably unhelpful north-south, which puts China in the same rank as Peru as a donor. Andrew Rogerson and I suggested last year that there are 5 principles that should cover all development finance: accountability to citizens, fulfillment of commitments, complementarity, mutual learning, and agreed human rights and environmental standards, to replace the Paris principles. I think the most important thing to recognise here is that the reasons for giving aid, sometimes it's implied, Hillary Clinton is the most famous exponent of this view, that other countries are giving aid for political and economic reasons, whereas the West is somehow giving aid for charitable reasons. Actually, you know, what this does, what the South-South cooperation does, is holds up a mirror to our own objectives. And we realise that, and this is very important when we think about the future of aid, the future of aid will not be defined by charitable analysis. That's a part of it. It will be defined by political interests as well. And that's important to remember. So just a quick recap. I'm sure Marcus is about to look at me. First, MICs still need aid and they can use it effectively. Secondly, they also want to supply aid for political as well as charitable reasons. And thirdly, global goals are expanding. One of the most important, one of the 2 most important trends in this era is our realization that we live within planetary limits. That's going to transform everything, including aid. So I was thinking about this. I was jogging up a hill in Colombia. It shows how very boring I am. Rather than thinking about my holiday, I was thinking about how do I square all this in my kind of vision for the future of aid. And the idea came to me, a global public sector. Now, it's a very unformed view so far, but I think it responds to some of the issues being raised by Brenda Killen and others yesterday about how do you communicate this massive change that most of us in this room are getting, but that to people just outside here is incredibly hard to communicate. People are very, especially in Britain and Europe, you saw the riots yesterday, very, very worried about their jobs and their own incomes and their children's future. So so this is just the final kind of, I suppose, idea to leave you with. People accept public spending at a national level. They don't, it's just absolutely a part of our way of understanding. Public spending on parks, on welfare for very poor people, on security and police, on investment in new technologies. That's just part of what we expect from our state, and actually it's, you know, a very large percentage of our GDP. So my suggestion is, let's start communicating that instead of aid from rich to poor countries, we're now living in a world in which all countries need to contribute to a better world, a civilized world in which we conserve the rainforests, the oceans, welfare for the poorest, security, and research into new technologies, be that climate technology, health technology. I think that message might begin to win over aid skeptics, and also is a better one for to bring in the fact that everyone now wants to contribute to that rather than just the traditional donors. So the final common assertion, and this has been there throughout my life in the aid business, right throughout the NGOs, we always said, you know, our job is to do ourselves out of a business. Well, that is also nowadays mixed leading, because our job is actually to transform the international public spending, global public sector is going to be here throughout the 21st century, and it's a good thing. It needs to expand rather than diminish. And our job is to allow aid to transform itself for a new era, rather than the implication of some, which is that as LICs become MICs, slowly aid diminishes to nothing. And I think we need to challenge that idea. Thanks very much.